So this is the third video. I had to wait a bit because the Wi-Fi was off. I also got caught up watching an interesting documentary about Russia and Ukraine, and basically it was focusing on Putin's irredentism, this notion of lost Russian pride and lost Russian territory. A lot of the stuff they covered I was already familiar with. The fact that Russia in the 90s was kind of free for all. It was flawed democracy, but it was very corrupt, high crime rates, and people wanted a sort of sense of order. Putin provided it. So in the early 2000s, it's very easy to see why Putin was, uh, why he cemented his power. I was going to say why he was popular. He's still very popular in certain quarters of the Russian population, but very interesting documentary, and it shows that Russia's been meddling in Ukraine for years. Um, Back in the 2004 election, presidential election in Ukraine, um, in which Yushchenko famously poisoned. Um, the whole point about the Orange Revolution was that people knew Russia had interfered, and they were furious with Yanukovych basically being installed as a Russian puppet. Um, it's very important to look back to that. But even going back further in history, the Holodomor, this documentary didn't cover that, but um, Russia and Ukraine may be have interwoven histories, but the national identity of Ukraine is a very, very real thing. Um, and a big difference between this war and the Iraq War is, whilst both were based on invasions, Britain and America never questioned Iraq's very existence. Britain and America are not in Iraq anymore, and the whole Russian narrative is to question Ukraine's very existence as a nation state. Um, And so much of the lies that has come from the Kremlin, this idea, for example, of being surrounded by NATO. You just have to look at a world map. The vast majority of the Russian border is in Asia, borders countries like Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China. So this notion of being surrounded by NATO is a complete lie. It is absolutely a lie. Even if Ukrainian presidents pitch to join NATO and the EU, that's Ukraine's right as a sovereign state. So pretty much everything that comes from the Kremlin regarding Ukraine um, is flawed. Recently, apparently, the first woman officer to die, or the most senior woman officer to die in the Russian armed forces, was taken out by a missile strike. Now, you sort of expect that from men in war. I mean, some of the positions that she held. But just like the Nazis had some very sadistic women, this one Olga Kuchera, I think her name was. She was born in Ukraine, but she was very pro-Russian, and she boasted. She boasted of war crimes, boasted of killing civilians. So I think she's the 97th officer to die, senior officer. But you know, that's the sort of depraved mindset of these Russian invaders and pro-Russian collaborators. And it's why Ukraine has to win. They just have to. Ukraine had charged her with war crimes in absentia. But anyway, she's dead now. Um, of course, she's being honored as a hero in Russia. This is the sort of people that Russia honors: war criminals, people who boast openly of killing civilians. So utterly depraved. Anyway, I digress. I want to talk about empowerment. Empowerment. My last two videos. So one of them was focused on the need to tackle youth crime in this country, and I feel very strongly about that. The other one was about how the police utilize the resources. I think that they tackle the wrong priorities. Um, a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video refers to freedom of expression and how important it is, but it's also about how people feel that they do or don't have a voice in society. And I'm not talking about identity politics here so much. I'm thinking in terms of the power structure. Because one thing, is worth considering. We always, in the West, like to think that we're better because we value freedom of speech and we value human rights. But we should never be complacent. We should never be complacent that given that we have freedom of speech. I think there are certain things that could be a recipe for greater state control. Now, there's areas I think the government should intervene. Definitely, crime is one of them. Crime against a person, no question about it. And when you have a situation where you have a small number of protesters who are basically holding the country to ransom, as insulate Britain is, I totally support the government taking action against that sort of sabotage of the public. I mean, they are an utterly undemocratic, antisocial bunch of extremists. So that sort of situation, I'm all for government intervention. But I do feel a lot of people have a sense that they're not empowered, they don't have a voice. I mean, we can comment on social media forums, and Twitter, Facebook have their rules. I've been sanctioned for I feel very unfairly for some very trivial things. An example being someone falsely accused me of racism. Well, that's not trivial. I, in frustration, said, "Try reading, idiot." Now, I was frustrated. I didn't like being publicly and unfairly smeared as a racist because I questioned some sleazy rap lyrics and someone insinuated it was racially based. Um, so anyway, I think the power of big social media networks is a very significant thing in all of this because the power and the influence that they have on the modern world is vast. It really is in terms of our interactions, in terms of even shaping elections. I think it is massive. Um, and that is why it is right that we always question how that power is used, how Facebook, how Twitter utilize the power. Because often we hear about, well, they need, social media can be toxic. They need to act against these hateful messages and cyberbullying. Well, cyberbullying is awful. I abhor all forms of bullying. But my big concern is that we are gradually losing liberty and freedom in areas that we may not fully consider. During the pandemic, the government, of course, like many countries around the world, imposed very strict lockdown measures. Now, most people followed them because they understood this was an exceptional situation. Um, Liz Truss has vowed she wouldn't give a green light to any sort of restrictions again, and that's good to hear. And I don't think Johnson really wanted to do it. He was pressured to do it because it was the advice that he was being given. The argument being that having minimal contact would stop the spread of the virus. To what extent it was effective or not is going to be a matter of debate. Some people will say it was a massive mistake and it caused a lot more harm than good. It exacerbated mental health problems. It caused economic problems and a whole host of other things. Domestic violence increased during that period, for example. But I'm all of the view that it was a temporary necessity. But I also feel that people want to feel that they have a voice. People want to feel that their rights are being respected. So governments have to be very careful. Democratic governments have to be very careful. And I'm talking about democratic governments. There's no point about talking about dictatorships because they are what they are. They're ruthless, they're brutal, they close all independent media outlets, they jail dissidents. They are what they are, whether that be Putin's Russia or Xi's China. That's how they operate. It's no mystery. But I actually think in democracies it's almost more complex because it's like this constant great balancing act because we want freedom, but we know that we all have individual responsibility as well. So there's no such thing as absolute freedom. Never has been, never will be. I mean, you don't have absolute freedom to go out and hurt an innocent person, commit crime. Um, and that's where I differ with some zealous libertarians. I think they basically are advocating a sort of anarchy. They'll deny this, but I think absolute freedom is foolish. It's never going to happen. Rather, what we need to have is as broad a freedom, as broad a spectrum of liberty as possible. In certain circumstances, if you commit a crime, your liberty is taken away. That's justice. Um, you're not going to have the liberty to walk around, to go shopping, to go to the cinema the way a law-abiding citizen would. Now, very few people would argue against that. That's why absolute freedom does not exist. People need to understand that as a starting point. Um, but if you try to navigate communicating with power, it's not easy. The experience I had earlier this evening is an example. Because of my strong feelings on crime, I want to be proactive. I don't want to just run. So I'm thinking, well, what way can I be proactive? I could donate to victims' charities. Well, I could, but I'm not financially well off, so that's not easy. I can start a lobby group, which again requires money. Um, so another recourse I have, okay, I'll contact the Secretary of State for Justice, which at the moment is Dominic Raab. So I think, okay, this is Dominic Raab's email. I send him a message. And after sending a lengthy message detailing everything I laid out in that video, basically, but it's a polite message. It's not just a rant. Well structured. It's polite, and it's to the point. It's clear. It's clear what I'm asking him. I get a message saying, it was something along these lines. I only receive messages from constituents, or if you have a query about the Department of Justice, and then I get a link to that. Okay, so that's a waste of time. So I go to this link, and there is a box that you can fill in to put forward your query, but there's a word restriction, so I have to edit my post. And now I understand that for practical reasons they can't accept big long essays, but my message was not excessive. It was the equivalent of a letter, a letter that you would send to your MP or to anyone. So it wasn't like an essay. It wasn't like a big lengthy dissertation, but it nor was it a fleeting sort of one paragraph message. And then there was a questionnaire saying give us feedback, and I told them, I said, this is restrictive. It's not. How can people be expected to give context and citations without, if you're restricting how much they can say? So I felt frustrated by that. If we look at the justice system, if you have a problem with a judge, it's next to impossible to have any sort of correspondence because, courts of law have a postal address. They may have a phone number, they may have a generic email, but this is all kind of a computer says no attitude because if, for instance, you feel that a judge is consistently lenient and you feel he or she should be held to account for that, there's basically no way to do it. If you feel that a case is too lenient, you can write to the Attorney General. She can forward that to the Court of Appeal, but the chances of anything changing are very, very low. And I know this because I've seen the cases that have been referred, and the vast majority of them, I guess 80-90%, nothing changes. In fact, it was the Wrexham Circuit sent me that message because I was following up on a case there. Um, the way I see it is citizens should have a right to ask questions of those in power. And it's not just politicians, it can be judges, it can be, frankly, anybody in a position of power, CEOs even, as long as you're not threatening anyone. And my concern is, what happened last year, I mentioned this, I think, in the previous video, the murder of David Amos MP. When I went to the Ministry of Justice, it said, we will not tolerate threatening or offensive messages. Now, the threatening bit, I understand. That's a no-brainer. Politicians have a right to feel safe. They have a right to not get threats, obviously, and that's understandable given what's happened. Um, I mean, the second MP in less than, well, in 5 years to be murdered, so that's totally understandable. Offensive messages, what does that mean? I have a real big problem with this sort of vague wording because an offensive message could be anything. It's vague. It's just vague. Um, because a word like offense is very much context based. What is offensive to one person is simply another person expressing their anger or frustration about something. Now, if you're simply calling people names, that's not productive. But I firmly, strongly, staunchly believe members of the public, like myself, should be able to vocalize their frustrations. And one reason I'm grateful for this channel and all my subscribers is this is one area to vacuum those frustrations. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't just use this as a rebound, and I don't just use this to have rants. At least I hope that's not how it comes across, because I cover a lot of things on this. But I do utilize this as one platform to do this. Absolutely. And why not? I know that people out there will be watching this and listening to my thoughts, and they might agree, they might disagree, but it's a small form of empowerment for me, and I urge anyone with a camera to do the same thing. You know, let your voice be heard. Now, this is not my channel is not a major channel. I'm not getting thousands or millions of views. Maybe that'll happen one day, in which case it kind of puts me in a position of some power because I think influence is power. We tend to think of power as being about politicians and business people, but actually, power can also be an influence. So, Alex Jones had power in terms of the reach that he had. I mean, at his peak, I think millions of people were listening to his nonsense. That's power. Celebrities have power. So, when we talk about empowering people, I think what it really comes down to is having a voice. This is why I think free speech should be as protected as widely as possible. The only limits I think should be if there's clear threats being made, if there's incessant bullying of individuals, or if it's a matter of national security. For example, if you have someone who's advocating for the Russian or Chinese regimes, there's national security issues there. If they're spreading lies, if they're spreading propaganda, if they're trying to recruit people, etc. If you have an Islamist hate preacher, he may not be calling for suicide bombers, but he could well be waging hatred against the West. Rishi Sunak got in hot water recently. James O'Brien was one of many on the left who roundly condemned this. He spoke about adding hatred of the United Kingdom to the prevent spectrum. I think it was somewhat taken out of context because I don't think Sunak was. He clearly wasn't talking about people questioning the government. He wasn't talking about people disagreeing with the government. I think what he had in mind was precisely that Islamist hate preachers, people who are stirring up such vitriol against this country that it poses a threat because it encourages terrorism. I think that's very reasonable. So I think the reaction to it was a bit overblown because I think it was like, oh, this Tory right wing populist is saying we can't criticize the government. That's not what Sunak was saying. Um, but fundamentally, I think everyone in a position of power, whether they be politicians or judges or any sort of body that works with the public, companies as well, they need to be prepared to have tough skin to listen to public criticism and public anger. Now, if someone's simply throwing out insults, it isn't practical. But if people are expressing legitimate concerns, legitimate anger, it's absurd for that to be categorized as abuse or offensive. Absurd. So, um, ultimately, in a democracy, unless you're breaking the law, unless you're hurting other people deliberately, Um, because I say that because, someone, like I say, could simply be voicing their political viewpoint, and an overly sensitive person might say, that's hurting my feelings. Or you might have a faith thing. Like I said, the example I gave earlier, a Christian might say, I believe gay marriage is a sin. Now, that doesn't correspond really to modern society, and a lot of people would disagree with that, but that's their firmly held conviction on religious grounds. They're not saying they hate gay people, they're not inciting hatred against gay people, they're simply expressing their view that it's a sin. So I think we all need to be prepared to grit our teeth sometimes and accept that there's going to be other people out there who say some things that we really don't like to hear, but we can't silence them. We can't. Um, I just think that there needs to be a common sense thing going on here, and the way police forces are trying to police people's thoughts is a big problem. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks a lot for watching. Let me know your thoughts.